Alexandria Library is one of the hallmarks of Egypt's coastal city. It was built around 285 BC and houses over 2 million books.
Trying to decipher hieroglyphs and then, the fact that we know that the Library of Alexandria was burned down.
Among the countless fragments of history lost to fire, war, and neglect, few have held as much mythical weight as the Library of Alexandria. For centuries, it has stood as a symbol of lost human knowledge, a reminder of how fragile the record of civilization can be. When word first spread that artificial intelligence had successfully decoded a scroll believed to have come from that library, the world paused. Here was a fragment of a civilization's voice, silenced nearly 2 millennia ago, suddenly speaking again. The AI, trained on vast linguistic models and ancient textual patterns, unraveled a tightly rolled and charred scroll, one that had resisted every other attempt at preservation or translation. What it revealed was nothing short of staggering, and the implications continue to echo through the academic and philosophical landscape. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. The scroll was not simply a catalog or a treatise on mundane affairs. It bore the weight of something far heavier, a discourse on the nature of reality and human existence itself. At first, researchers expected commentary on mathematics, astronomy, or politics, subjects typical of the Hellenistic period. Instead, the scroll opened with a meditation on perception, describing reality as a construct woven by the human mind, rather than a stable external truth. This notion, written centuries before Descartes, Kant, or modern physics, suggested a sophistication of thought that few had dared to attribute to the scholars of Alexandria. The AI's translation was meticulous, reconstructing broken sentences into fluid arguments, and what emerged was a worldview both alien and disturbingly familiar. The implications rippled across the scholarly community. If thinkers in Alexandria had already touched upon the idea that reality is subjective and malleable, then much of modern philosophy and even science might not be as novel as once believed. The scroll described existence as layers, with human perception operating like a veil draped over deeper truths. The choice of words implied that behind the material world lay a structure, perhaps even a simulation, governed by rules that only the most enlightened minds could glimpse. While some dismissed this as allegory, others saw it as the first articulation of what today would resemble simulation theory. That it had surfaced from the ashes of antiquity struck many as terrifying, not merely because of what it claimed, but because it hinted at how much had been lost when Alexandria's shelves burned. The scroll also contained chilling warnings. Its anonymous author described knowledge as both a gift and a curse, comparing it to fire in the hands of children. There were passages that cautioned against pushing inquiry too far, lest humanity stumble upon truths it was ill-prepared to wield. In one particularly unsettling section, the author described civilizations collapsing not from external enemies, but from within, corroded by truths they could neither ignore nor integrate. When AI first parsed these sentences, historians debated whether the author was reflecting on the fragility of empires or issuing a timeless warning about the dangers of unchecked curiosity. To those who had always regarded the Library of Alexandria as a beacon of pure enlightenment, this tone of caution introduced a darker, more ambiguous dimension. The terrifying element lay not only in the content of the scroll, but in the timing of its decoding. Humanity is standing at a threshold where artificial intelligence, quantum physics, and genetic engineering are pushing the boundaries of what it means to be human. That an ancient text from one of the most storied repositories of knowledge should re-emerge at precisely this moment felt uncanny. The parallels between the warnings of the scroll and the dilemmas of modernity were striking. Where the author spoke of fire in children's hands, one could just as easily substitute AI, nuclear power, or biotechnology. The sense of history whispering directly into the present was unnerving, as though the scroll had been waiting for humanity to reach this stage before revealing its message. Perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of the translation was the style of the text itself. Unlike many surviving ancient works, it was written with an almost clinical detachment, its tone more analytical than poetic. It read less like the musings of a philosopher and more like the notes of an investigator who had peered into a hidden architecture of reality and returned shaken. The AI, trained to identify stylistic fingerprints, noted that the scroll's voice bore similarities to fragments attributed to Hypatia's predecessors and even pre-Socratic thinkers, but it was distinct enough to suggest an author of independent genius. Whoever this figure was, they had clearly wrestled with questions that modern humanity continues to struggle with. The AI did not just decode the words, it reconstructed the cadence, the rhythm of thought, offering a glimpse into a mind long turned to dust. The very act of AI decoding the scroll was itself a commentary on the intertwining of ancient wisdom and modern technology. For centuries, human scholars had tried to pry apart the carbonized layers of such texts with crude tools, often destroying them further. AI, however, could map microscopic variations in density, reconstruct hidden letters, and cross-reference fragmentary words with known linguistic patterns. What emerged was not a perfect transcription, but the closest humanity has ever come to hearing an ancient voice preserved in its own cadence. The idea that a machine could resurrect knowledge thought irretrievably lost created a sense of awe tinged with unease. It was as if the library itself had reached across time, using modern technology as its mouthpiece. The content of the scrolls suggested that Alexandria may have been far more than a storehouse of books. If its scholars were grappling with ideas about the malleability of reality, consciousness as a generative force, and the dangers of knowledge itself, then the library might have functioned as a crucible of existential inquiry. The destruction of such a place takes on an even more tragic dimension when one considers that humanity may have lost not just records of history, but insights into its own condition. This realization is what many found terrifying. It meant that our modern struggles, whether with AI ethics, metaphysics, or the fragility of civilization, were not entirely new. They had been anticipated, confronted, and written down 2,000 years ago, only to vanish until now. The decoded scroll also reshaped perceptions of what lost knowledge might mean. Historians have long speculated that the library housed works from across the ancient world, from Egypt and Mesopotamia to Greece and India. If one text could contain such profound metaphysical speculation, what might others have held? Advanced mathematics? Forgotten medical practices? Political blueprints? The scroll's existence was proof that the destruction of Alexandria was not merely the loss of records, but possibly the derailment of human progress by centuries. That realization weighed heavily, as it forced a re-evaluation of what history might have looked like had that knowledge survived. The fear came not from what was revealed, but from imagining all that was not. In the days following the decoding, debates raged over the authenticity of the translation. Could AI have overinterpreted ambiguous characters, imposing modern frameworks onto ancient words? Yet even skeptics admitted that the coherence of the text was undeniable. The arguments followed a logical progression. The warnings were consistent, and the style bore unmistakable traces of ancient rhetoric. What unsettled many was not whether the text was real, but that it was too real, too aligned with the dilemmas of the present. It was as though humanity had been handed a mirror crafted in antiquity, reflecting not only its face but its shadow. The scroll's revelations also cast new light on the myth of the library itself. For centuries, the Library of Alexandria has been romanticized as a temple of wisdom, destroyed by barbarism and ignorance. Yet here was evidence that within its walls, scholars were already grappling with truths so disturbing that they themselves counseled caution. The library may not have been a place of untroubled enlightenment, but a site where knowledge was both pursued and feared. The decoded text made the legend more complex, not a utopia of wisdom lost, but a fragile experiment in confronting truths too dangerous to leave unexamined. That complexity deepened the sense of awe and dread surrounding the discovery. As the AI reconstructed more of the scroll, additional fragments emerged that seemed almost prophetic. The text described how civilizations, in their hunger for mastery, often mistook control for understanding. It warned that tools created to extend human reach could one day eclipse their makers, turning humanity into custodians of forces they did not command. Modern readers could not help but see in these lines a reflection of their own anxieties about artificial intelligence itself. The irony was palpable. AI, the very tool warned against in spirit, had been the one to unlock the warning. It felt like a loop in history, an Ouroboros of knowledge consuming its own tale. The decoding of the scroll forced a reconsideration of the boundaries between myth and history. The idea that ancient thinkers could articulate something so close to modern theories of perception and reality challenged long-held assumptions about the linear progression of knowledge. Instead of seeing human understanding as a steady climb, the scroll suggested cycles: knowledge gained, lost, rediscovered, and perhaps lost again. The terror lay in the realization that we may not be advancing toward truth, but circling around it, glimpsing it in fragments, only to forget and relearn. Alexandria's scroll, decoded by AI, was one such glimpse, fleeting, powerful, and unsettling. What struck many readers was the humility woven through the text. The author did not write as one who had mastered the cosmos, but as one who had peered into its depths and recoiled. That humility contrasted sharply with the hubris often associated with modern science and technology. The scroll reminded humanity that knowledge is not always illumination. Sometimes it is exposure to a vastness that dwarfs human comprehension. In a world where AI promises answers to everything from medical mysteries to cosmic riddles, the scroll's message resonated as a sobering counterpoint. The past was reminding the present that not all truths are meant to be seized without caution. The event of AI decoding the scroll is more than a historical curiosity. It is a collision of eras, an encounter between the wisdom of the ancients and the tools of the future. It revealed that the questions humanity asks today about reality, power, and the cost of knowledge are not new. They are ancient, perennial, and perhaps unresolvable. The terrifying truth is not merely what the scroll contained, but what it implied: that humanity may always live on the edge of truths too vast to bear. That knowledge is both salvation and peril. And that the fires that consumed Alexandria did not extinguish those questions, but only delayed their return. The revelation of the decoded scroll did not end with its immediate contents. Once the initial awe subsided, the wider implications began to take root in the minds of scholars, scientists, and even those outside the academic world. The Library of Alexandria had always been wrapped in mystery, shrouded by legends of its vast collections and tragic demise. Now, with a single decoded scroll speaking in a clear voice across time, those mysteries grew sharper and more urgent. The implications spread outward like ripples on still water, reshaping the way humanity looked at its past, present, and future. The great question centered on the origin of the scroll itself. How had it survived? The very notion that any original material from the library still existed seemed extraordinary, for it was commonly believed that centuries of fire and decay had obliterated nearly all traces. Yet here was proof that fragments had endured, hidden or preserved by accident or design. Some historians speculated that the scroll might not have been consumed by fire at all, but rather stored in a sealed chamber, forgotten beneath layers of sand or architecture. Others suggested that it had been deliberately hidden by those who feared its contents. The warnings within the scroll gave weight to this possibility. Perhaps some ancient custodian recognized the danger of such ideas and chose to bury them rather than let them spread unchecked. If so, then the scroll's reappearance was not just chance, but the unraveling of a decision made by hands long dead. As analysis deepened, more startling layers of meaning began to emerge. Linguistic specialists pointed out peculiarities in the phrasing that suggested the author was drawing upon sources older still. The language bore hints of Egyptian influence, and even certain terms echoed concepts found in fragments of Mesopotamian texts. This raised the tantalizing possibility that the scroll was itself a synthesis, a distillation of even older knowledge gathered from multiple cultures. If true, then the Library of Alexandria had not only preserved knowledge, but actively fused it, creating a cross-cultural dialogue centuries before globalization. The AI's decoding revealed subtle references to cycles of history and metaphors drawn from astronomy, implying that the author may have had access to records now considered irretrievably lost. What emerged was not just a philosophical treatise, but a window into an intellectual ecosystem that had been richer and more interconnected than previously imagined. The philosophical heart of the scroll, its depiction of reality as layered and malleable, sparked endless debate. While many found the parallels with modern simulation theory unnerving, others pushed the conversation further. If the ancients had contemplated such a model of existence, what practical knowledge might they have tied to it? Some theorized that the description was not metaphorical but an early recognition of the psychological and neurological basis of perception. In other words, the scroll may have been describing in rudimentary language the brain's ability to filter and shape reality. Such a view anticipated discoveries in neuroscience by 2,000 years. Others went further still, suggesting that the author might have stumbled upon concepts akin to quantum uncertainty, the idea that reality shifts depending on the observer. These interpretations may have been speculative, but they underscored the power of the text to ignite questions that reached across disciplines. One of the most chilling elements lay in the scroll's insistence on boundaries. The author argued that human inquiry should not always push forward unrestrained, for there were truths that could fracture societies and destabilize the human spirit. This notion clashed directly with the modern ethos of unending progress. In an age where scientific discovery is pursued relentlessly, the idea of voluntarily restraining curiosity felt alien, almost heretical. Yet the scroll framed it not as suppression but as wisdom. Just as a child must mature before wielding dangerous tools, so too must civilizations be measured in what truths they are prepared to handle. The unsettling implication was that humanity might not yet be ready for the very truths it is now chasing. This was not a comfortable message, and it forced uncomfortable introspection across academic and political circles. The decoding also raised questions about the role of artificial intelligence itself. The irony was inescapable. The warnings about dangerous knowledge were delivered to the modern world through the very technology most often accused of being uncontrollable. Without AI, the scroll would have remained an indecipherable lump of ash and papyrus. With AI, its voice had returned, sharper than ever. This made AI both the liberator of ancient wisdom and the embodiment of its warnings. For some, this reinforced the urgency of establishing ethical boundaries for artificial intelligence. For others, it was a sign that perhaps AI's emergence was not an accident, but part of a larger arc of history, one in which humanity repeatedly confronts tools that threaten to surpass it. The Decoded scroll also deepened humanity's fascination with the mythology of Alexandria itself. For centuries, the city had represented the pinnacle of ancient learning, a crossroads where Greek, Egyptian, Indian, and Babylonian knowledge converged. With the scroll in hand, that vision became less abstract. Scholars began to speculate about what other scrolls might have survived, hidden in collections or ruins yet unexplored. Archaeologists redoubled their interest in searching beneath the sands of Egypt, wondering whether caches of such scrolls still waited to be uncovered. The possibility that other works of equal or greater significance might exist became a tantalizing prospect. Every mention of Alexandria's vast collection, hundreds of thousands of texts covering every imaginable field, suddenly felt more vivid. The Decoded scroll was not just a relic, it was a spark that reignited the dream of rediscovery. In the cultural sphere, the scroll unleashed a wave of fascination among the public. Media outlets described it as a message from the ashes, a whisper from the ancient world that unsettled the present. Philosophers, writers, and artists seized upon its imagery, producing works that explored the fragility of knowledge and the terrifying weight of truth. Popular debates erupted about whether humanity should pursue forbidden knowledge or respect the boundaries set by the ancients. For many, the scroll became a mirror reflecting humanity's current anxieties about technology, power, and fragility. The past was no longer silent. It was speaking directly to the present, and its message was heavy with unease. At the same time, the decoding of the scroll offered a profound lesson about preservation. For centuries, scholars had treated history as a patchwork assembled from fragments, incomplete and riddled with gaps. The Decoded scroll proved that those gaps were not permanent voids, but puzzles awaiting the right tools to solve them. Knowledge thought lost forever had been resurrected through persistence and innovation. This realization injected a sense of urgency into the preservation of cultural heritage. If AI could recover meaning from a scroll reduced to cinders, then perhaps countless other damaged or fragmentary texts could still be revived. The terrifying truth here was twofold. Humanity had lost far more than it knew, but it might also recover far more than it ever imagined. The Library of Alexandria had not died completely. echoes of it still whispered in the ruins, waiting for ears willing to listen. Another striking implication came from the scroll's vision of history. Embedded within its warnings were references to cycles, descriptions of civilizations rising and falling in patterns that seemed eerily predictive. The author spoke of knowledge as a double-edged force, capable of lifting societies to heights of achievement, but also of hastening their collapse. This cyclical view of history challenged modern linear narratives of progress. It suggested that humanity might be trapped in recurring arcs, rediscovering the same truths, and stumbling over the same dangers across millennia. The terrifying thought was that nothing was entirely new, not even humanity's current anxieties about artificial intelligence or existential threats. The ancients had already recognized the shape of these dilemmas. The real question was whether humanity would respond differently this time, or simply replay the same tragic pattern. The stylistic analysis of the scroll revealed another intriguing dimension. The writing was methodical, stripped of flourish, yet it carried an unmistakable sense of urgency. This was not a text meant for casual readers, but for a select audience, perhaps fellow scholars or political leaders. Its warnings were too pointed, its caution too sharp to be mere philosophical speculation. Some suggested that the scroll was part of a larger dialogue, a debate among Alexandrian intellectuals about the very project of knowledge accumulation. Was the library itself an act of hubris? Could its vast collection, instead of securing wisdom, overwhelm humanity with truths too dangerous to handle? If so, then the burning of the library was not merely an accident of history, but an act of erasure that reflected these anxieties. Whether intentional or not, the destruction of the library aligned with the warnings of the scroll, that some truths might be safer left in silence. The decoded text also challenged assumptions about the role of ancient science. Modern perspectives often cast ancient civilizations as technologically primitive, focused on myth and superstition. Yet here was a text that demonstrated a rigor of thought startlingly advanced. It dealt not with gods and rituals, but with the architecture of existence, the ethics of inquiry, and the fragility of civilization. The author's insights suggested a mind grappling with universal questions in a way that transcended the boundaries of its era. This forced a reevaluation of how history portrays ancient thought. Far from being quaint precursors to modern philosophy, the ancients may have reached insights as deep and as dangerous as anything conceived today. The decoding of the scroll also highlighted the strange relationship between knowledge and time. For centuries, the scroll lay dormant, silent, meaningless. Only when the right conditions aligned, AI powerful enough, scholars curious enough, did it speak again. Knowledge then is not static but temporal. It can vanish for centuries, waiting for a moment when humanity is ready or unready to hear it. The terrifying truth was that knowledge has its own timing, independent of human will. The scroll resurfaced not because humanity planned it, but because history had circled back to a moment where its message was suddenly relevant. That sense of inevitability haunted the discovery, as though the past had conspired to confront the present with its own reflection. The more the scroll was studied, the more its presence began to feel like a catalyst. It forced new alliances across disciplines, historians working with physicists, philosophers with computer scientists. Everyone sought to make sense of the convergence of ancient insight and modern technology. What bound them together was a sense that the scroll had collapsed the distance between epochs. It showed that the dilemmas of knowledge, power, and truth are timeless, woven into the fabric of human existence itself. The Library of Alexandria was no longer just a memory of loss, but a living participant in the present, its voice speaking again through the channels of AI. Perhaps the most unsettling realization of all was that the scroll changed the way humanity viewed itself. It shattered the illusion of modern uniqueness. The belief that today's dilemmas are unprecedented, that humanity stands alone at the edge of uncharted territory, dissolved in the light of the scroll's warnings. Instead, humanity saw itself as part of a much longer continuum, one in which others had already glimpsed the same abyss. The terror was not in discovering something new, but in realizing that humanity's struggles were ancient, recurring, and unresolved. The Library of Alexandria had not just held knowledge, it had held mirrors. And in the decoding of this scroll, one of those mirrors had been lifted again, reflecting not just the ancients, but the present, with all its ambition, anxiety, and peril. The decoding of the Alexandrian scroll did not only challenge academia and intellectual culture, it also sent tremors into the very structure of how societies organized themselves around knowledge. Once its contents spread beyond scholarly circles, governments, corporations, and religious institutions began to realize the weight of what had emerged. The scroll was not simply a piece of parchment covered in ancient ink. It was a conceptual bomb that raised unsettling questions about the trajectory of civilization, the ethics of discovery, and the ownership of knowledge. It became more than a relic. It became a catalyst forcing humanity to confront its deepest uncertainties. One of the first arenas where its influence became visible was in politics. Leaders quickly recognized that the decoded material was more than an intellectual curiosity. It was a weapon of narrative. The idea that ancient thinkers had already warned against unrestrained knowledge meant that modern debates over technology and governance were suddenly infused with an unexpected authority from antiquity. Nations that had been slow to regulate artificial intelligence or advanced technologies found themselves pressured by the implication that even 2,000 years ago, the dangers of unchecked inquiry were already foreseen. For policymakers, this gave an entirely new rhetorical force. When laws or restrictions were justified not only by contemporary necessity but also by the voice of antiquity, they carried an aura of inevitability. At the same time, rival states accused one another of hoarding or misinterpreting the scroll to advance their own agendas. What began as a moment of intellectual discovery became a stage for ideological conflict. Religious institutions also reacted with intensity. For traditions that viewed their origins as ancient and their wisdom as timeless, the emergence of a non-religious text from antiquity, grappling with questions of existence and the nature of reality, presented both opportunity and threat. Some groups sought to claim the scroll as evidence of humanity's innate drive toward spiritual truth, pointing to its recognition of hidden layers of reality as validation of mystical teachings. Others saw it as a dangerous intrusion, an ancient text that challenged or even undermined established doctrines. The most unsettling aspect for many was the scroll's insistence that knowledge itself can destabilize civilizations. If this was true, then no religious or secular authority could claim immunity. The scroll leveled the field by suggesting that fragility is universal, that all human systems are vulnerable to truths too vast to control. In the realm of science, the decoded scroll opened entirely new avenues of speculation. Researchers in physics were fascinated by its descriptions of layered realities and perception as a veil. Though written in metaphor, the parallels to concepts of quantum superposition and the role of the observer were hard to ignore. Some physicists argued that the author had, in primitive terms, stumbled onto the realization that observation changes the phenomenon observed. Others went further, suggesting that the ancients might have possessed frameworks of thought that approached what we now call quantum metaphysics. Neuroscientists, too, found themselves drawn into the debate. If the scroll's commentary on perception reflected an understanding of the mind's power to shape experience, then perhaps the ancients had touched on early cognitive science. This blurred the boundary between philosophy and empiricism, forcing modern disciplines to reconsider their assumptions about the originality of their discoveries. Another profound dimension unfolded in the field of education. For centuries, education had been built upon a narrative of steady progress, humanity's ascent from primitive superstition to rational modernity. The decoded scroll cracked this narrative open. It revealed that the ancients were not merely fumbling in the dark, but grappling with the same fundamental questions that dominate intellectual life today. This realization transformed how teachers and scholars approached history. Instead of presenting ancient philosophy as a prelude to modern thought, the scroll demanded that it be seen as an equal voice in an ongoing conversation stretching across millennia. Students began to study the text not as curiosity, but as philosophy with living relevance. The terrifying truth in education was that progress could no longer be viewed as a straight line. It had to be seen as cyclical, fragile, and easily undone by lost knowledge. The scroll also forced a new reckoning with technology itself. It had been unlocked not by human hands alone, but by artificial intelligence. This meant that AI was no longer simply a tool of convenience. It had become a vessel of resurrection, pulling the voices of antiquity into the present. This relationship raised unsettling questions. If AI could reconstruct lost wisdom, could it also become a filter that determined which voices from the past would be heard? Could it shape human history by choosing what to resurrect and what to leave buried? The scroll's warnings about tools that eclipse their makers seemed eerily relevant here. Humanity had created a machine to aid its understanding, only to find that the machine was now mediating the voices of history itself. This was both exhilarating and terrifying. AI had not only given humanity a message from the past, but had also become entwined with the meaning of that message. Geopolitical consequences soon followed. Nations began to consider the strategic implications of AI-assisted archaeology. If one scroll from Alexandria could shake the intellectual foundations of society, what might dozens or hundreds of others reveal if unearthed and decoded? The race to locate and recover ancient texts became as charged as the space race or the race for nuclear power. Egypt, as the historic home of Alexandria, suddenly found itself at the center of global interest. Excavations were funded with unprecedented urgency, as the possibility of finding other works, mathematical treatises, medical knowledge, or even political blueprints, promised to rewrite the balance of global power. The scroll transformed archaeology from a scholarly pursuit into a geopolitical arena, with nations vying for control of whatever fragments remained hidden beneath the sand. If you liked this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on AI decoding the Library of Alexandria scroll? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.